I've been in Wilmington for just over a year now. I'm not going to tell you, just as a quick disclaimer, I'm probably going to tell you anything you don't already know today, or anything groundbreaking or new. You are the experts on your history. I'm going to instead share sort of my journey since I've been here over the past few years on how I sort of used what resources were available to me to learn about my new home. My wife and I were just the other night saying how absolutely and wonderfully friendly everyone in Southeast North Carolina is. And it's so exciting to be in a place where people care about their local history, where people are interested in uncovering sources from the past and connecting their own stories to sources of the past. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, how I used whatever resources were convenient to me to sort of walk through and learn more about my new home. And of course, this is a fascinating region, as you know. I grew up in the South Carolina Piedmont, and then I've also lived in the Midlands of South Carolina and Columbia. I lived up in Durham for about 6 years. My father is from Roxborough, which much like Duplin County is historically tobacco country. Of course, that's changed over the past 30 years or so. But this is the first time I've had the pleasure over this past year of living in the coastal region of either Carolina. And so it's been a real treat to learn about the unique culture and geography here. But no matter where I've lived in the Carolinas, and for whatever reason, I've moved around a lot, but it's always been in the Carolinas. I don't know, I guess that's just in my blood or where I'm supposed to be. But I've looked for resources to learn about my new home. And so the process of learning about Southeast North Carolina, as I mentioned, is facilitated by the fact that it's my job. So I get to mix business and pleasure in a sense, and on work time do fun history research, which is a great privilege, and I don't take that for granted. But also, it's very convenient because so many sources are just about a 50-foot walk from my office across the second floor of Randall Library. And for a long time, Special Collections at Randall Library has been collecting books and manuscripts. They've been collecting maps, audiovisual material, anything you can think of having to do with Southeast North Carolina. And so I looked through our online catalog, and I found some great resources that I think are going to be really helpful as I continue to learn. Of course, my learning hasn't stopped and never stops. As I continue to learn about what one memoir touted as North Carolina's #1 agricultural county. So Duplin County is, like I said, already appearing to be a fascinating place, and I'm excited to learn more. So some of Duplin County's history is, of course, well known. We have this great book in Randall Library called Flashes of Duplin's History and Government, and the McGowans, a husband and wife team, published that in 1971. I see some heads nodding because you know that book. And there's some wonderful transcriptions of letters, of government resources, of government documents, I mean. So there's a lot on education, there's a lot on military, religious life. It includes a lot of material on really some of the most well-known people who have ever lived in Duplin County, people like James Keenan or James Gillespie. Lots of lists of soldiers. Sort of the interesting thing about our copy of that book is it was donated to us by State Senator John J. Birney. So it's signed by him in the front of it. So we have that book. We also have, for example, a nice genealogical research file on the Gillespie family, again, which is well known, including Congressman James Gillespie and his son David, who I learned last week helped survey the western boundary of the United States right after independence from Great Britain. So just a really fascinating set of resources there, and they give a nice 30,000-foot view of Duplin County. You get a nice sense of who the leaders were, especially before 1900, and a good sense of the march of history, politically speaking. But community leaders, of course, are vital to understanding a community. You have to understand what their motives were. These are often people who made decisions. These are often people who had a great stake in seeing a community not secede. That was a slip. I'm from South Carolina. Sometimes it comes out. Succeed. But one of the hallmarks of Southern history and literature, one of the things that scholars have identified that's unique about people who study and write on the South, is the sense of place that really comes through in writing. Plantations, swamps, lakes, roads, beaches, they often take on a life of their own, and they become characters in the dramas that unfold in stories or in historical writing. And so one of the great books we found was Leon Sykes' book, and it was so great to meet you taking money at the beginning when I walked in the door, because that book was really neat. And when you see the place names in that book, you realize that they have their stories. And so you have names like Kitty Murray Landing, Ephraim Boney Road. And of course, this is something that happens throughout the South. Your road is named after your grandfather, and that's where they lived. But then some others like Billy Goat Curve and Sheepshank Crossroads. I don't really know where Billy Goat Curve or Sheepshank Crossroads are, but again, fascinating names. I discovered the neighborhood of Tin City. Does anybody know where Tin City is? Yeah. So that was fun. And then somewhere called Foxskin. That one threw me a little bit. I don't know what goes on in Foxskin or if it's even still somewhere that's known. But they're all chronicled in his Duplin County Places, which is this wonderful, again, I'm not telling you anything new, a gazetteer of local geography, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And I, for one, have enjoyed looking through it and sort of placing names with the maps in the back and trying to figure out where things might be and where Billy Goat Curve might have been. And other landmarks that are known, like Boney's Mill and things like that. So any source, I think, that can enhance our understanding of place, whether it's something like the transcriptions in the McGowan's book that sort of give the sense of what the leaders think, and also books like Leon Sykes's that talk about place names. And so we've got a great book, again, that your Historical Society helped publish called Along the Banks of the Old Northeast. And that's one of the great things about that book is it's amazing to see how many buildings from the 19th century still survive in the 21st century. And so I spent a lot of time with that one. And for example, the William Wright Faison House, which still stands, and which has a Wikipedia page, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, but that local structure that is on the National Register of Historical Places has this Wikipedia page. And the book also, though, I think, tells a nice story in that it talks about those fights for historic preservation that fail. So you have many that survive, and many places in Duplin County have made it onto the National Register of Historic Places. But you also have buildings like the Benjamin F. Grady School, and it talks in that book about how there was a fight to save that school, where many people graduated from, yet that fight was lost. Or, for example, the Magnolia School, which portions of it still stand today, but much of it was torn down. And so, Along the Banks of the Old Northeast is a book I'm still sort of working through. It's got hundreds of photographs and really substantial descriptions of the buildings when they were built and who might own them. So it's been a great source. But we also have, for example, Frank Ainsley's excellent book, if you haven't seen this, on historical architecture in Warsaw, which is something that, and Frank Ainsley's papers are actually with us in special collections. And so I haven't gone into his papers to see if he's got anything extra that he didn't include in that book on Warsaw. But again, these books are really helpful to understanding the sense of place. We have a nice folder on the Perry Cherry House, which I realize is just over the line in Wayne County, but it's in Mount Olive, which sort of straddles Wayne and Duplin. And so that was a nice thing to look at. And of course, Liberty Hall. We got some nice books on Liberty Hall and its restoration. And there's that nice connection between the Keenans and UNCW, because of course our chancellor lives in what's called the Keenan House in downtown Wilmington. So historic places, historic buildings, historic churches. And that's why I'm so excited about this book. One of the images I was looking at was a Birch Chapel Missionary Baptist Church, which I see is one of the first churches profiled in here. But the Wesley Chapel, the Chinquapin Presbyterian Church, of course the Grove Church, some of the oldest churches in North Carolina right here in your region. I enjoy these architectural history books and these church history books for the same reason I enjoy a lot of learning about place names and things like that, because you really get to what daily life was like for so many people. As Delilah mentioned, churches keep records, but they also keep records of things that people might not think are that important. How much money was spent to fix the roof, for example. Who fixed the roof, which sometimes is just as important to reconstructing a community's history as some of the more well-known types of historical sources. And so church buildings, church history being sort of my own area of study that I like to look into, has been really helpful to understanding more about Duplin County. And really, you can't understand North Carolina or the South, I don't think, without understanding the history of religion. And the history of church buildings is one of those things
that we see. Is that rain or is that the air conditioning unit? I think that's the air conditioning unit. Well, I hope it holds. So, and so if we really want to get down to talking about daily life, and we really want to get talking about the details of daily life, and we talk about church life, and we talk about buildings, cemeteries often do that better than anything because they really get down to brass tacks. People are born, people are died. What was their life like? How did they live that life? And we've got a great resource at Randall Library that's sort of a recording of what is written on gravestones at the Rockfish Presbyterian Church, another really historic Presbyterian church in Duplin County. And this is important because while we say the phrase set in stone, of course, we know that time and weather can very easily erase what is set in stone. And so things like Find a Grave, or people who have gone around and during the 1930s were put to work by the government recording what was written on gravestones, that can be an invaluable source and very interesting. So we see in the Rockfish Presbyterian Church, Robert Tate's headstone, and he founded that church. It also says that he organized churches of Hopewell, Rockfish, Keith, and M.L. Williams, and was instrumental in the evangelism of others. So some people just have a birth date and a death date. Some people have more written. Of course, Ransom Lee Carr, a very well-known person here, notes that he was a Democratic senator and representative, journalist, Presbyterian elder, faithful and skillful physician, loving husband and father, faithful below, did his duty, but now he's gone aloft. And so you get these nice synopses of people's life. Often these headstones will note military service. George Boney King Jr.'s headstone in Rockfish Presbyterian Church I thought was especially interesting because it noted that he was not actually buried there, that his remains were at the military cemetery in the Philippines. And so we see these headstones and we think it's just a cemetery, birth date, death date, but no, there's so much information that can just be gleaned that doesn't make it into history books or doesn't make it into books about the leaders of a community. But yet that information is necessary to community life. And so there's a real poignancy when I came to the source that we have that was another Duplin County publication, Duplin County Historical Society publication, in honor of Duplin County's Vietnam War dead. And the stories of the men from Duplin County who died in the Vietnam War were truly touching. I'm beyond draft age myself. We were just talking about the draft with Bill there and draft numbers during Vietnam. But I do have a young son, and so I sort of see things from a different perspective now. And so I came across stories of people like Dallas Irvin McKinney, who grew up in Magnolia, and who studied accounting at James Sprunk Community College, and was engaged when he went off to Vietnam, and was there for 7 months before he died. And then as a former high school teacher, I see, it's sticking together, humidity. People like Charles Gray Costin of Warsaw, who was only 18 when he went to Vietnam and died. And so we see the gravestones in Rockfish Church. We see publications like Duplin County's Vietnam War dead. And it becomes clear that family history connects to local and state history, which connects to national history. These men who died in Vietnam, their personal story intersected with geopolitics. And so in history books, we read about the Vietnam War. In school, we learn about the Vietnam War. But often, the 30,000-foot view can obscure how emotional and how truly poignant learning about history can be. And so many thousands of people have passed through Duplin County. They have been born here and perhaps moved away, or maybe they've shown up here from elsewhere. They may or may not enter the historical record. And so you have to even dig deeper sometimes to find out about what life was often like for some people whose names may have never made it into history books. They may have a gravestone or they may not. There are so many cemeteries that have disappeared. And so one of the great sources that we have that I was able to come across, again, published by the Duplin County Historical Society in some cases, were the 1790 census transcription, abstracts of land entries from Duplin County from 1778 to 1795. We have several compendia of marriage license from 1749 to 1868. We have one great publication, which is we have 6 volumes of the Court of Pleas and Quarter Sessions minutes, those abstracts of those minutes from 1784 to 1805. And so you see very mundane things in there, transfers of acreage from one person to another, the sales of slaves, the execution of wills, Of course, James Keenan and James Gillespie appear all the time in those. But other names like Thomas Norman and James Pearsall, sort of local leaders, were witnesses. They were executors of estates. And you get to see again more of daily life. But there are other names that I want to focus on just for a moment. The court records of January 1795 list Hannah Simmons, who was an orphan and who was apprenticed until the age of 21 to a lady named Betsy Burnham. The interesting thing here, she was only 1 year old. She was a free-born Negro, now about 1 year old. And of course, her new guardian appears to have been a white person. Coming from South Carolina, where slave laws were so much different in the 1780s and 1790s, it was interesting for me to see the numbers of free people of color who were born here in Duplin County. There was another young lady named Lettice, a free Negro girl now about 8, who was apprenticed to a white landowner and was, quote, was to learn to work and labor so as to get her living thereby, end quote. And we have little way of knowing whatever happened to Lettice. There is a Hannah Simmons that appears in the marriage records for 1835, showing that she did marry someone named John Burnett, but we don't know if this was the same Hannah Simmons. There were orphans who faced hardship often. The court records mention a Charles Savage who was, quote, so low in a state of health that he could not do any service to said master, nor learn his trade, and still continue sickly, end quote. His master was a man named Nathan Waller, who asked, quote, that he be released from said indentures, end quote. And the court granted his request. Now, as to what happened to poor Charles Savage, we don't know, but he was, it seems to have been cast out, although in 1802 there is a Charles Savage who purchased 67 acres from someone named Alexander Saunders, and then on that same day turned around and sold 67 acres to someone named John Felix Hall. Now, we don't know what's going on there, and those are those little things in history that you look at and you're like, why did he buy such an odd number of acreage and then turn around and sell it right back to somebody else? And is this the same Charles Savage who was an indentured servant who was so sick that his master had to put him out on his own because he couldn't get any labor out of him? There's another indentured servant named Benjamin Wilkins, who was apprenticed so that he could learn to Nathan Waller, the same person who cast out Charles Savage, took in Benjamin Wilkins so that he could learn the trade of the cooper, to read the Bible, and decipher as far as the rule of 3. That's an end quote. So Wilkins had been an apprentice for somebody else, but was then cast out by that person and given another master. So you see these movements in the court records, and what do you think to yourself, what must life have been like for an apprentice or an orphan who was placed in that situation? So we don't know what happened to Benjamin Wilkins, why he was moved from one master to another. Sometimes we do get a sense of why somebody was let go, like with Charles Savage. So there was an apprentice named Nancy Hines who was 16. She was apprenticed to Thomas Finley for about 18 months, but he asked the court to release him from his duties because, quote, he is not pleased with the said apprentice and that she is of such a wicked disposition that he cannot govern her and bring her up agreeable to his indentures, end quote. So they didn't get along, obviously, but she was very immediately apprenticed to someone named Jeremiah Bass Foley. We don't know, again, what happened to them because their names don't show up in marriage records, their names don't show up in land records, but there are these tantalizing mentions in court documents. Who are these people from history? Now, of course, enslaved people of Duplin County appear in court records quite frequently. The records for 1798 to 1803 mention about 77, and most of the names appear as part of sales of slaves. There are other accounts from the minute books that provide a more detailed accounting of what life must have been like for enslaved people. In 1802, an enslaved person named Daniel was ordered whipped 20 times for stealing bacon. Daniel's master, Robert Williams, had to repay Thomas Finley for the stolen bacon. And we don't know what happens to Daniel after that point, but he disappears from the court records and probably from the pages of history. There is a mention of someone named Abigail King who freely indentured herself. She's a free woman of color to Joan Smith, binding herself to him for life. And you do a little digging, and of course you learn that interracial marriage was illegal at that time. And it becomes clear that this happened from time to time because there were white men who wanted to marry African American women, and the only legal way to do it was for the African American woman to indenture herself to the white man. And so this seems strange when you see somebody willingly indenture themselves for life, but then you do a little digging and you find out that there was probably a historical reason for it. Other people were sold, like I said, in these court records, but then there were happier stories, like a man named William Duncan, who presented his petition in the court for his slave Adam. It was, quote, a mulatto slave named Adam, who has behaved well and for meritorious services, said Adam, prays that Adam may have the privileges of the law of this state, and such case made and provided may be extended to said Adam, and that he be liberated and free, end quote. The court granted that privilege and declared Adam, quote, entitled to privileges of other free citizens of this state, end quote. So the records of leaders are important, the records of places and buildings are important, but these legal government records that so often just capture tidbits of life. When somebody has to go sell something or when somebody has to go to court to prove themselves innocent, or in this case, somebody wants to set one of their enslaved people who works for them free, people enter the pages of history at various moments. And these become valuable sources for reconstructing a holistic view of a whole community. We do get full manuscript collections sometimes, like those of Willis and Amanda Wilson, who are farmers around the Magnolia area. They farmed corn and cotton, which is not surprising. That's what everybody did at that time. They had about 24 enslaved people at once. That's the most number of slaves they had. They had 5 children, one of whom fought for the Confederate Army and became ill outside of Charleston. He was not the only one. Those swamps claimed many, many lives during the Civil War. Excuse me, not from warfare, but from disease. He was part of the Company B of the 51st North Carolina Infantry. Of course, the Duplin Rifles were the 46th, I believe, so he was of a different group, but he came home. He died in 1863 of an illness, and we have records all the way up to 1865 of his mother, whose husband died in 1860, hiring slaves from other plantations to come work for her to get things done. But these slaves, whether hired or owned, appear only by first name in the collection. So we have a Sam here, or an Owen there, or an Ellen there. And so they're intriguing clues for African-American genealogists, but as Delilah was mentioning earlier, there's so much in the world of African-American genealogy that gives us little definitive proof. So we can follow leads and we can make conjecture, but there's so much that is difficult to trace. So this type of manuscript material presents so many wonderful opportunities and so many frustrations. You have multiple people with the same name, or the same person who decides to spell their name one way when they're young and a different way when they're old. Or you have place names that disappear from memory. So where was Sheepshank Crossroads? Somebody may or may not know anymore, but it's mentioned in a letter. How do we know where this happened? So you have people who show up in the historical record, and maybe they disappear for decades and then show up again, or maybe not, or maybe they're gone from the pages of the record forever. And I suspect that all of us, we have a love of history that's very personal. We have grandparents or relatives who told us stories, and we wanted to learn more, or we wanted to learn about our own lives or our pasts. And not to get too technical about the ways academia is set up, but in some places, history is in the social sciences, and in some places, history is in the humanities. I'm going to say right now that history is a humanity, because if the humanities are about learning who we are and learning about human cultures, there's no better way to do that than to learn about the past of where we live. And so that is often, and I discovered when I taught high school, the best way to connect what the students are learning to themselves. And that emotional connection was almost magical. When I was at Hillside in Durham and I taught students about why Cornwallis Road might be named Cornwallis Road, all of a sudden the American Revolution took on a new meaning to them because they walked down Cornwallis Road all the time. Or when I talked to them about Bennett Place, which they'd driven by many, many times perhaps without noticing, why Bennett Place was such an important moment in Civil War history, those emotional, personal connections all of a sudden make their story relevant, their personal story relevant to what they read about in history class. This is one of the primary reasons why I'm so excited to be at UNCW, which is a regional university. We focus our collecting on the 8 counties of southeast North Carolina. We focus on Bladen and Brunswick, Columbus, New Hanover, Duplin, Sampson, Onslow, and Pender counties. That's where we want to collect material from. And as I mentioned earlier, we collect books, manuscripts. So if you've got any church histories that have been locally published, bring them to me. I would love to add them to the collection. If you've got any cookbooks, because how many times have you opened up a cookbook and the first page is the history of the church? So the recipes are great, don't get me wrong, but there's historical value there. So anytime there's a published source like that and that you have an extra copy or you don't know what to do with, feel free to contact us. We'd love to add it. Manuscript collections, photographs, audiovisual material. Bill was talking earlier about his career. We just took in the WWAY tape collection going back to 1982. So there's a load of local history in those tapes that needs to be extracted and made available. But that's what we want to do. That's what we strive to do. And it's so great working in a region, like I said, that is so committed to local history, where we can take in things, collect them, build a collection that will help students at UNC Wilmington, but also high school students, also researchers like yourselves, learn about the past and maybe find that missing piece of the puzzle that helps complete your story. Most of our stories are some combination of the Keenan story and the story of people like Daniel, or some combination of people like Thomas Pearsall and the indentured servants that I mentioned. And so anything that we can do to help people put those pieces together, we are excited about. And so we want to encourage people to use our collections. We have the resources I mentioned, and we have a lot more too. We have historical newspapers on microfilm, like the Eastern Carolina News. And my favorite title of a North Carolina newspaper, the North Carolina Amateur. They didn't think too much of themselves, but that's what they called their newspaper, the Amateur. We have a lot of government records. I was telling Rebecca, I found this out last week. We have microfilm government records, especially court records, from the 18th century to the 20th century in our government documents section. I'm still learning my job, obviously, but that was amazing to me to see what we have. We have current newspapers on microfilm, like the Warsaw Face and News, the Duplin Times. And so we want to make sure that people know that these resources and can access them. And along the lines of collecting, preserving, and providing access, we want to do everything we can to support your work. And so there's a wonderful Dallas Herring Library and Reading Room now over in Burgall. We want to make sure that we can help you, if you desire, to have materials placed on websites to be made available on the internet worldwide. We want to do that. We're starting a long-term project of trying to work with local historical societies to help them find what they have that they might want to digitize, and working with them to do that. Our digital initiatives librarian, Ashley Knox, is very excited about doing that. We're not necessarily here to take things, but we are here to help digitize if you so desire. So we are excited that collecting is going on, and we want to work with anybody who wants to work with us about preservation and digitization to see if we can help make that happen. So if you want to talk to me about any things we have, like I said, I don't think I share anything new today other than just my love for learning about Duplin County. But if you want to talk to us about anything we have or anything that we might do, just approach me afterwards, or Rebecca, the Special Collections Librarian, and we'd be more than happy to talk to you. So thank you again for having us. It's been a real pleasure, real treat to come out here on a Saturday.